I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion with Erika Hecht, a remarkable hidden child of the Holocaust and retired interior designer, originally from Hungary. Erika is joining us today from Sag Harbor, New York. Welcome, Erika.
Thank you.
Erika has spent the last many years beautifully writing her story and reflecting on it in the memoir, Don't Ask My Name, A Hidden Child's Tale of Survival, just released last month by East End Press. You can order the book at the link in the Zoom chat. I'll interview Erika today for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for audience questions. So please feel free to share your questions in the Zoom Q&A box throughout the program, and we'll address as many as we can towards the end of the hour. Without further ado, let's get started. Erika, thank you again for being here.
You're welcome.
I want to begin the conversation today in the same way that you begin your book, which is with the story of your conversion from Judaism to Catholicism in 1937. Can you tell us a little bit about your early childhood in Budapest and why you converted?
Well, my conversion, of course, had nothing to do with a decision by me. It was a decision of my mother's. I was 3.5 years old, and I was tagged along to the church. I do remember it very clearly, due to the fact that I think little children remember traumatic experiences. And for one reason or another, that experience, my mother taking me to church and having First Communion and being so totally nervous and upset about it, is something that stuck in my mind, and I clearly remember it as I wrote in my book, including the priest and the kneeling down and all those things. And her joy and sorrow when we left the church at now being a Christian and not having to worry about being in danger. And now we are safe, we are Christians, she said. So that's my memory of that conversion. But I grew up with it from then on. I mean, I was a Catholic, but I was also Jewish. My grandparents, whose house I stayed in most of the time, my mother having been divorced at that point and not yet remarried, they were Jewish, they were observant. So I was Jewish there. But then when I started to go to kindergarten, I was registered as Catholic. I was all of 4 years old, 4.5. So it was a mixture from the very beginning, from my age 3.5, 4 years old. I was the Catholic and I was the Jew. So.
Erika, are your memories of Budapest from before the war mostly happy ones?
My memories from Budapest from before the war. Well, my memories with my grandparents are pretty happy ones. That's before I really started school. But the beginning of school was not bad either. But by second grade, by the time you had to wear a yellow star, I no longer qualified as a non-Jew. I was registered as a non-Jew at one point, but I was not qualifying. I did not have 4 non-Jewish grandparents. So I had to wear a yellow star. And from that time on, when the yellow star and things changed in school, when all that started, it was a conflict. And it always remained a conflict for the next, 50 years, I guess.
We have an amazing photo of you as a little girl around the time that you're talking about. So I'm going to pull it up on screen. Mm-hmm. And can you tell us about who this is on the right with you?
That's my father, my real father, my original father. And that's like I must have been, well, on the left, I was about 6, I suppose. And on the other one, I must have been about 8.
These are really remarkable photos, and I'm grateful that they survived the war so we can see them today.
Yeah.
Erika.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that these pictures came out of my late mother's collection. Her collection survived with some friends. She gave it to some friends, and I got them back after the war. I didn't have any leftover pictures or anything like that.
I should mention that all the photos that you'll see during today's discussion are featured in the book, along with other photos from Erika's life. So Erika, you mentioned that your mom converted you and her in 1937 because she felt that being Catholic would be safer for you. Can you talk about the increasing restrictions on Jewish life that you remember at that young age?
The what? I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
It became increasingly challenging to be Jewish when you were a young girl.
Yeah.
How much do you remember about the progression over time?
Well, it was extremely difficult for us. The reason that the Catholic instruction at school was very rigid and very strict, and I was being prepared for First Communion. I had to learn the Catechism by heart as a Catholic, and I was taught a lot of things, including the fact that Jews killed Christ and all of those old-fashioned basic facets of anti-Semitism given to people who didn't know any better. So that was going on. But on the other hand, it was fascinating. I was looking forward to my First Communion. I remember that. The white dress, the thing in my hair, and all the festivities that went with it, which is something that was fun, that was nice. And a lot of the girls in my class went to First Communion. So it made me part of the group, I guess.
How did your observant Jewish grandparents react to the conversion?
My grandfather was an observant Jew, and his opinion was, and I do remember that because discussions happened quite often. And before I went to school, before I started first grade, I lived with them due to the divorce. And he said to my mother, anything to save your life is permissible. In these times, whatever you can think of to do, or whatever you're going to do, don't worry about it. You have one obligation, and that's to save your life. And that's, my mother repeated that often. I don't know whether she really believed it or whether she wanted to soothe her conscience. I don't know, but that sentence became part of like the family, the family belief.
I guess that obligation to save a life above all else is part of Jewish religion. So if your grandparents were observant, that would have been a
Yes.
real religious, meaningful religious tenet.
Yeah.
So restrictions were being added and you were experiencing anti-Semitism. At some point you were required to wear a yellow star, and then your life really changed when German forces occupied Hungary in March 1944. Is that right?
Yes, well, it changed to more serious because that's when all the deportations started. Well, not only were Jews restricted from doing things and going places and buying food and going for a walk and living in designated houses marked with big yellow stars too, but they were now not allowed to congregate anywhere or to visit anybody, and they were rounded up, and you never knew when you were going to be rounded up, and they were mostly rounded up by the Hungarian Erikas with the help of the German Gestapo, and put into trains, first into big factories outside of Vienna, and then into trains and brought to one of the concentration camps, not necessarily always Auschwitz, but any one of the already existing concentration camps. And this was something that was known, and it was kind of whispered about. And by this time, when this was happening, I was 10 years old. I remember it distinctly. And I also remember how one had to do everything to avoid being rounded up or doing anything that would bring attention to you so that you will be rounded up, or doing anything that went against regulations.
At 10, were you taught to be more fearful of the German Nazis or the Hungarian Arrow Cross, the sort of local Nazis?
Well, the local Nazis were in some way more dangerous, but it was the German Nazis that really killed you. The local Nazis took you away. You never really know what happened. And they were, I am not sure whether they put you on the trains. They brought you to the Germans to put you on the trains. I don't know the exact way it happened, but if a Hungarian Nazi came and got you, you were just as dead as if a German Nazi came to get you.
So by the time the Germans occupied Hungary, you, even though you had converted to Catholicism, you were once again being treated as Jewish and persecuted as
Yeah,
Jewish.
absolutely. Yeah.
Did your mother at that point regret the decision to convert, or do you think it still saved you in some fashion in those intervening years?
I don't know if she ever regretted it, because after the war, when it was over, and she could have easily returned to being Jewish, or officially Jewish, she didn't. She wanted to remain officially Catholic. She wanted to have Catholic papers. She wanted to never ever having to face anti-Semitism again. But at home, she remained Jewish. You weren't allowed to use your fleischig and milky dishes together. And I don't know, there were other things that were from the Jewish religion that she kept. And no, and then my grandmother was by then widowed after the war. She came to live with us, and she kept some of the Jewish traditions. So it was very much the Jewish traditions on the inside and the Catholic life on the outside.
Erika, I want to keep asking you about your story, but I'm thinking and listening to you that what you're describing is so similar to the stories we hear about the conversos in Spain during the Inquisition, the many
That's right.
Jews who converted but kept up Jewish practice internally. Yeah. Did you then, or do you now, feel some sort of connection to those people?
Well, there was a book that I don't know if you ever heard about, but I read and I reread again and again, called the Mezuzah in the Madonna's Foot, which had to do with the Spanish converted Jews that in order to kiss the mezuzah that they had to kiss when they came into the house, they hid it in the Madonna statue's foot. And they kissed the foot of the Madonna when they came to the house.
Wow.
It was a delightful book.
Wow, I've never heard that before.
No?
So once the Germans occupy Hungary, it's 1944, your father, in a really remarkable act, was able to secure fake papers and arrange for you and many other of your family members to go into hiding in the village of Kiselang. Yes. Can you tell us about how the escape was arranged to the best of your knowledge?
Well, I know that it was arranged by my real father, because my stepfather, Pishta, has been taken to work camp and was on the Russian front digging ditches for the Hungarian and the German army. But we were arranged by my father's servant, somebody that worked for my father, who arranged his village, which was a godforsaken place in the center of Hungary, in the western part of Hungary, called Kiselang. And Kiselang was his birth village, and it was actually run by his uncle and aunts and whatever. So basically he owned that village, or his family owned that village. And they were extremely grateful because this man worked for my father for a long time. And so he arranged for us to be able to go and live in that village if we had papers that said that we were Christian, papers going back to 4 grandparents. So my father obtained those papers on the black market. And there was a long, maybe a week so preparations, where he came to the designated house where mother and I and my then half sister lived, to indoctrinate us in our new names, our new history, our new friends, our new relatives, a whole created world of people and occasions that weren't true, including this fake father who was a famous officer on the front fighting the Russians. I mean, the whole story. And all of that was told to my mother, and part of it to me. And I was taught my new name, our new name. I was taught our new history. I was taught on how to react if people asked me things. And I know that I found it very difficult to do that. And I did, I learned it all. But then, this is actually where the title of my book comes from. Because one day, just before we left the designated house and escaped to Kiselang, my mother woke me up in the middle of the night and asked me my name. because she wanted to make sure I remembered it. But it was my mother. So I didn't tell her my fake name. I told her my real name. And I think she beat me up like I've never been beaten up before. Do not ever do that again, or else we'll die. And I've never ever mentioned that name again. Only historically much later, but I mean, I never ever mentioned it again.
What a heavy burden for a 10-year-old to have to learn how to adopt that identity and understand the stakes of it.
Yeah, especially the year before that, I refused to go to the synagogue to visit my grandparents who were still going to synagogue, because I learned in my Catholic lessons that it was a deadly sin for me to go into a synagogue. You don't go inside a synagogue. That's a deadly sin. So, you know, the contrast there was sort of, anyway, it was quite remarkable, I think.
Confusing, yeah. Can you tell us about what life was like hiding in Kiselang?
Well, when we got to Kiselang, the first maybe 8 months or a year or whatever it was, or however long it was, were quite pleasant. We had this little house in which we lived, and we had a person called Vargabachi, who was a relative of the person who got us there, who brought us the food and news and everything. And the owners, the teachers living across the street, I wasn't really allowed to go to school because they felt I will be asked too many questions and whatever. But I went for private lessons to the teacher's house, and they were lovely, and they had 2 children, and I felt quite comfortable. And except for the restrictions on, you know, you mustn't tell anybody, you mustn't talk, you this, that, you have to be careful, don't bring attention to yourself. Except for those things, it was quite pleasant, and there was enough food. And there were 2 horses and 2 cows at the teacher's house, and several chickens, and always some good food. So it was quite pleasant until the first occupation by the Russians in December, early December, 1945, and it was really quite miserable. But it only lasted 2 nights, and we came out, and we were now under the Russians. And somehow our Jewishness became known. I guess it was already suspected in this village, but it was safe. But now it became general knowledge. And that was quite comfortable until the Germans came back, because that was a part of Hungary that was reoccupied, I think maybe 3 or 4 times between Germans and Russians. So the Germans were coming back, and a Russian officer who became our friend and who was Jewish himself, so it seemed, provided us with some transportation to get out of that village and to go as far west with the Russians as we possibly could. And that's when this odyssey of a journey started.
Before we get into that, I'm going to pull up some photos from the book here from Kiselang. Can you just describe what we're seeing?
Well, you see the little house that we were in hiding in for quite a while in Kiselang. This was the side of it, and it had a little garden with a little fence and several chickens. And inside there is this attic, and the attic was accessible by a ladder. And later on, when Pishta, my stepfather, escaped from the work camp and arrived to join us without papers and everything else, we hid him. We hid him in the attic for about 2.5 months. And nobody was supposed to know he was there. It was very candlestick. It was very, actually, it was quite exciting. I thought of it more exciting, but it was also very dangerous. And nobody was supposed to know, not even my little sister was supposed to know that her father was in the same house, so that nobody can give him away or us away or whatever. And only until the next occupation, because in the meantime, we got reoccupied by Germans, and then the Russians came back. And by the last Russian occupation, he finally managed to re-enter everybody's lives. And I mean, our life, and not be in hiding anymore. But that was in another place. That was in Balaton, Canada, to where we got by hook or by crook during those, during the battles.
And can you remind us, why didn't your mother's husband Pista have papers like you did that enabled him to live outside the attic?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Why didn't Pista have papers like you did, fake papers that said that he wasn't Jewish?
Well, Pista wasn't there. Pista was in a work camp in Russia, on the Russian front, taken by the Hungarian army to dig ditches because
So
he was Jewish.
So your birth father, who was divorced from your mom, was upstairs in the attic, and Pista was off.
No. My birth father is the one who gave us the papers in Budapest. Mm-hmm. And then he went back to his non-Jewish wife, which is why he, who was a half-Jew, ended up being counted as a non-Jew because he had a non-Jewish wife. Mm-hmm. And he's the one who provided us with all those papers. He's also the one who had adequate money because all the Jewish people he used to work for wrote over their properties to him. So he owned a couple of apartment houses, he owned a factory, and he had lots of money, and he spent it on saving his family. He was extremely generous and very, very instrumental in saving our lives. But Pista wasn't around. Pista was in Russia in a work camp. And Pista ended up with us in October, the same day as I don't know if you historically know, but there was a putsch in Hungary when Horthy gave up, and we were supposed to be no longer on the German side, but by that evening we had a completely anti-Semitic. Cellars was the man who took over, and he was more dangerous than some of the Germans. He was a real born anti-Semite and a proponent of the German policies. Anyway, so that's when Pista escaped. And my father, he went to see my father. You see, everybody in those days was friendly. I mean, the fact that they were divorced didn't have anything to do with the fact that you had to save lives. So you could save life and had the money, you did it. So my father saved Pista's life, and he saved our life. Then he saved his brother's wife. It was one of those things where saving people's lives became the responsibility of those who could afford it, or who had the means to do it, or the ability to do it. And that's what was happening. So my father told Pista where we were, and when Pista started out to join us in Kiselang, it was, we were under a new regime, which was no longer German-oriented. When he arrived, we were under censorship, and we had to hide him. If he would have been under the other regime at noon, he wouldn't have. Well, I mean, it is crazy, but that's how it was.
Wow. So Kiselang becomes the center in late 1944 of, it's occupied and reoccupied by the Germans and the Soviets. And then at some point you flee westward with your mother, Pista, and your baby sister. And the following months-
in a carriage, in a horse-drawn carriage given to us by the Russian officer.
The next few months are really a remarkable and harrowing saga. Can you describe what happened to us as you left the town?
Well, we went for a while, but the battles were raging across us. We went on a side road, and this Russian officer explained that we should stay on the small road in the middle of the two main roads, and on the main road on the right were the Russians, and on the main road on the left were the Germans, or vice versa, advancing. And all the fighting went on over our heads. So it was pretty scary. And as we are approaching more and more open territory and more darkness, the carriage in front of us has a full hit. And it's very scary, and things are flying around and all of that. And I don't know, that scene is pretty hard to talk about, but what happened was things were flying around, and I see something landing on my mother, and it happened to be a leg with a shoe in it. And she took the leg and she put it over the side of the carriage. And then I look, and next to me is a soldier looking at me and reaching out to get me. And I think, my God, he's crying. But he wasn't crying. It was one of his eyes was running out and down his face. I'm just looking, but he's reaching out and he's falling back and he's dead. And so Pista, who was holding the horse to not go more crazy than it already was, he sort of goes and takes the carriage and pulls it around and tells me not to look. And we're driving over this body with the one leg. And then we're going and looking for a road, over the road. And we're going on the road. And my mother says something like, we have to get off this road. We can't stay on it. We'll get killed. And the other people are killed. I mean, the people who were in the first carriage that got hit, one of them died on this side and the other one was on the ground and they were dead. But we were not, and we were going to look for somewhere to stay or to go or to hide. And so we saw a little road somewhere ahead of us on the left, and we turned, and we went to this house. There was a house there. And this is the people, that's the person who let us in. And that's where we spent the night. And that house was full of refugees already. He let everybody in. And there was some food on the table. It was really quite civilized. And he said, all these people were hungry and you're hungry, and find a corner and eat something and go to sleep. And so, but around early in the morning, the Germans were back. When we got there, we were still under the Russians. But early in the morning, the Germans came back. And it was banging on the door. And the Germans came in. And my mother, the always anxious one, tells Pista, don't talk, let me do the talking. And but the Germans are asking if anybody speaks German. And my stepfather, Pista, was from Vienna. And he spoke German, of course. And he said, yes, I do. And they engaged him as a translator to go into the villages to find food for them. Anyway, it's a long story, but what happened is we went with the Germans, and they put us on the German truck, and we had no papers. And Pista had no papers. We still had some papers, some false papers, but Pista had no papers. And my mother was scared, and Pista said, don't worry. And that's when I actually have that story, which you'll excuse me, but I think it was a very important story and lesson. When Pista said, I made sure that I peed next to the main officer, because Pista, being from Vienna, was not circumcised. So he made sure that the German officer saw him and realized that he could not have been Jewish because he was not circumcised. So we didn't need papers to prove that Pista was okay. And we went from there, and we stayed, I think, maybe 10 days or so with the Germans. And then eventually ended up in Kiselang, where my mother, not in Kiselang, in Kanasha, Balaton, Kanasha, because my mother couldn't stand it anymore, and we decided we had enough of the Germans. So she pretended to have an appendicitis. And she was so good at it, she scared the soldiers we were traveling with. So they dropped us off in the place called Kanasha because there was a hospital up there. And that's how we ended up in Kanasha.
Erika, I've heard so many amazing stories of people surviving Nazism, but I've never heard of anyone who was embedded with the Nazis like you were for 10 days on their carriage. And I mean, the fear you must have felt, I can't even imagine.
I don't know how bad it was for me at that point, because it was very cold. We were all very hungry. As long as these Germans went and got some food, and they gave us some, we lived on the truck. We slept on the truck. We were on the truck. And then I also had my little sister, who became my charge in many ways. And she was very vulnerable. and she didn't have enough food. And at 2 or 3 times during that period of time, personally, I was worried that she's not going to make it because she was that sick and that hungry and whatever. So I don't know. I don't know how much of it I realized at that point. And frankly, I think that was a very general experience. Now that I think about it, at that point, these German soldiers whose truck we were on were our security. Of course, they didn't know we were Jewish. Had they known we were Jewish, we would have been killed that instant. So, which is a very interesting thing to think about.
How do you, I mean, there are multiple times in your story in which there were Germans or Hungarians who saved you thinking you were Catholic. They provided you with food or security or shelter. How do you feel gratitude towards them or anger because you know that if they found out the truth, they wouldn't have helped you? How do you deal with that set of emotions?
Well, it's confusing. It was confusing, I'm sure. But it was at that time, somehow or other, it was a fact of life. You know that being Jewish brought the danger with it of being killed. You didn't think about it. I mean, I think I was too young to really go into the reasons why it was like that, except when I was taking Catholic religion, they told me I killed Jesus. But I don't think I took that very seriously. But I think it was unexplained. It was not, you know, you do think and you do want to make sure you know what's happening. But when you're hungry and when you are in instant danger and when your main preoccupation is to think where your next food is coming from, and the fact that if you don't get something to cover up with, you're going to freeze to death. By the way, that was the coldest winter January months in Hungary, in the almanacs and in every book. It was the coldest winter ever. And it's still, when we ended up in that ditch, I don't know if you read it in my book, when we ended up in the ditch and the German soldier came and saved us for some reason or another. It was the coldest, most horrendous winter that they have had in history. So it was pretty bad.
Erika, I want to pull up another photo from the next chapter in your story. Can you describe to us what we're seeing here?
This is my daughter Marian, my oldest daughter, and she's in a cave. And the cave is in the mountains on the end of Lake Balaton, called the Turkish caves, because they were used by the Turks during the Turkish occupation, both for storage and for prisons. And there's several of them on that mountainside. And these were the caves that the people from the village, mostly women and children and older women, fled to when the fighting around that place, Balaton Kenese, got very fierce. So we took off also and went to one of these caves and lived in that cave for about 10 days. And we were maybe, I don't know if we were 10, 12, 15. It was full. It was so full that you couldn't, you had to lie down one next to the other straight. You couldn't really turn or do anything. That's how full the cave was. And we lived there with very little food for about 10 days until the fighting was over. By which time it was the last Russian occupation, maybe the 4th or the 5th, and on that trip. And that was it, that was the liberation. That was the last one. After that, the Germans never came back. They were beaten back. And eventually, after about 10 days, we came down from the cave and found the village was really destroyed. And the place where we stayed before, where that German soldier took us, was gone. He was dead, and the place was gone. And we ended up living on the porch of another house that was occupied by German soldiers too, until, things got a little more straightened out.
When you returned with your daughter, where that photo was taken many years later, how did you find the specific cave?
But I remembered where we went.
Hmm.
I remembered when we went up there. I remember my mother going ahead because she was afraid there won't be any space left. And we couldn't go fast because Pista could barely walk. I had the baby I had to carry her. So we were slow. So she said, you come, I go, I find there's a cave and I'll meet you. We'll come up. It's a walk that leads up to those caves. And I don't know if you see the picture in my book, there is another picture of the wall with the caves, and there is a passage that leads up to there. So I knew it was on that passage, and I knew it was a fair size, and it was very much at the top of the mountain. And in fact, I was also looking for some bullet marks because I was being shot at when I was in that cave because I couldn't stand it in the back. So I went and I stood outside the camp, outside the cave. And one of the German, or who knows, I don't even know what kind they were, but somebody from a plane was shooting at all these refugees in those caves. And the bullet hit left, next to my left leg, between my two legs and on the right. And it was making this dust, and everybody in the cave started yelling, and my mother was screaming, and they pulled me in, and they never let me go outside the cave again.
So this is just at the very last stretches of the war. You mentioned that the Russians reoccupied the area. Once you felt it was safe, your family returned to Budapest. You were 11. What do you remember about returning to the city? Who or what was left of your former life?
Well, what was left was kind of pretty dismal. But by then, I've been through all the war zones. I've seen all the destroyed houses. So maybe in Budapest it was a little more clear. But it wasn't anything new. I mean, I've seen all those destructions and everything. But looking for the who was the major preoccupation. Who is alive? Well, my grandmother was alive, but my grandfather was not. And finding him or finding out what happened to him became a preoccupation. My mother's sister, my cousins, uncles, aunts, where are they? Were they taken? Are they alive? You know, who has remained? Who came back? Who came back? Like when somebody heard of somebody who just returned, came back from Auschwitz, they descended upon this person. I remember it because we were looking for my uncle. We descended upon this person with names and questions. Did you meet such and such? Did you see so and so? Is this one alive? Is that one alive? And that whole time was preoccupied by trying to find out who was alive and who stayed alive and who was going to come back. My aunt and uncle didn't come back. My cousins didn't come back, and so on. So that was what was more impressive even than the destroyed houses. I stayed with my father, who had a nice apartment which wasn't destroyed. My mother and Pista and my sister stayed with the grocery store owners around the corner, who my mother got friendly with. And they let her and them stay in the shop window of their store. You know, because there was a lot of destroyed places. I mean, you couldn't. And also apartments weren't given back right away. So you had to find places to stay at. My grandmother was in the hospital. My grandfather was dead. So just trying to figure out your family relations was very important or very preoccupying.
So you resettled and tried to rebuild your life. And then in 1948, your family fled Hungary ahead of the communist takeover.
Yeah.
You were shared earlier your experience with the Germans and also with the Russians, and it was much better with the Russians when you were in Kiselang. How did you make sense of the difference between those two groups, and how did you know what was in store for you before the communist takeover of Hungary?
Well, the communists just didn't want to let you live properly, and the Germans want to kill you. So there was that difference was clear to me, because the German policy was that, you know, get rid of the Jews altogether. and the communists didn't want to get rid of you per se, but they certainly didn't want you to have anything. They certainly put you into jail if you said anything against the regime. It was a different kind of horror story, but it did not end up in death as easily as the Germans did. The Germans just took you out of the designated houses, took you down to the Danube, and shot you. They wanted something you had in your apartment that they wanted to take. They didn't ask any questions. They took you, shot you, and then they took what they wanted. So it was not a question.
Sure. And I don't mean to draw a comparison between the two, but you did have sufficient concern about the communist takeover that you fled Hungary before 1948.
Absolutely.
Right?
You didn't want to live. I mean, we had a nice house by then. We were probably not going to be able to keep it. You were very restricted in what you could do and what you couldn't do. I was being indoctrinated. I went to May 1st celebrations with thousands of kids and banners and everything else, thinking the regime was wonderful. I did. I mean, if I look at it, I was a Catholic, I was a Jew, I was a communist, I was going to be a nun. I mean, all those things that give you some kind of a strong belief. I went through all of those things, and I got disappointed in all of those things. And I decided not to keep any of those things because none of them are redemption. None of them are going to change the way things are in the world. So, but you have to find that out, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Erika, we'll turn to audience questions in a minute, but I want to ask you one more question as part of our interview. You, in 1991, participated in a hidden child conference in New York City that changed your life. Yeah. What happened at that conference, and how did it lead to your decision to write this book?
All right. Well, first of all, let me say that eventually I ended up marrying a Jewish person who didn't care much about, who was a distant relative, and he lived in Canada. And I ended up giving up my medical profession, which I already had, and married this person and went to Canada and became a Jewish housewife. And that was pretty comfortable, and for a while. And I became quite familiar with Jewish life in North America, and I became familiar with Israel. I learned a lot of things like that. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. What did you ask me?
Oh, no problem. I wanted to dive into the Hidden Child Conference in 1991 and what it meant to you.
What happened in my marriage was that now I was Jewish. I had to reconvert. I was Jewish, but they had absolutely no interest in my experience as a non-Jew. They didn't even want to know about it. They did not want me to tell anybody that I was ever converted. That became my next shame. Like being Jewish was my shame for a long time. Now my being Catholic was my shame. So it was not the redemption in one way or another. I absolutely had to deny all those Catholic backgrounds. Oh yes, you were in a convent. Convent schools were good. It was good for you to be in a convent. Nobody had accepted the fact that I was there because I was a Catholic and I was going to be a nun. But anyway, that's how it was. So, and then I got divorced. And by then I was already doing interior design. And I had my own business and I was making a bit of money. And I got divorced because that was not working. And I read about this conference that was going to take place in New York, and it really spoke to me. They mentioned a story that was a little bit similar to mine. I called up and I registered. They told me they'll have 300-400 people. I got to New York and they had 1,600 people, but they were all very, it was, I will never forget it because it was so typical of our mentality. There were people standing there, but they were all anxious. They didn't want to commit to being there. So they came to see what it was like. They wanted to see what it was like. They didn't want to commit until they were safe. So, and I could feel that in the atmosphere, but eventually everybody, I mean, a lot of people stayed, 1,600 people stayed. And all the workshops were led by psychiatrists and psychologists, all of them survivors as well. And I went through the most incredible experiences I wrote in the book of this woman. And I call it, she cracked me open. In other words, she really did. You know, she was really, really, really instrumental for me being able to talk about it and to admit to it. And then all the other people that I sat with every night for 3 nights in a row, who came from similar backgrounds, all were converted people. All were people who lived as non-Jews for a while. They were very interesting, I thought.
Mm.
And then, because of that, and because I spoke up here and there, I got recruited to the speaker bureau of ADL. And ADL sent me to various schools, including some in Vermont, where I had a country house at the time, and in Montreal and everywhere else, to speak to kids in school, 13 and 14-year-olds, and to speak about the experiences. And slowly all these experiences and scenes came back to me, and I'm talking about it. And my most ardent supporter was my daughter, who said, finally, I'm going to find out about the things that were just a black hole in my heart. And anyway, so she's the one who encouraged me eventually to write down some of the speeches that I was making, write notes. And the notes and the things that I wrote down became the basis for this book. So that's how this book came into being. But it wasn't a continuous effort. It took me 91. Well, I didn't start writing it until 20 something, but still it took me like 15 years to write it, because I stopped and I moved from Vermont to here and all of those things. Anyway.
Erika, thank you so much for sharing. And a reminder to the audience that you can read Erika's full story in her book, Don't Ask My Name, A Hidden Child's Tale of Survival, at the link in the Zoom chat. We're going to turn to some audience questions now. Erika, there's a question from Mallory who's asking, when did you tell your own children your story and how did they react to it?
My own children didn't know my full story until after 1991. They knew, I mean, we were Jewish, that's okay. I was in hiding, but that was just a war thing. They did not know about how I felt about it or what the whole thing was. They didn't. And after I went to that conference, that the full story became known to them. And Barbara, they're very fine. I mean, my children are, they went to Jewish, they did not go to Jewish school, except for my son. My daughters went to secular school, but they went to Jewish religion classes. They've been to Israel. They spent summer on kibbutz. And I mean, they are Jewish kids. They are not religious. They are not observant, but they are very Jewish. So.
There's a follow-up from Barbara, which says, how do your children relate to being second generation survivors? Now, I'll mention, Erika, when we were speaking earlier, you rejected the label of survivor, felt that it wasn't true for you, but you were a hidden child. So could you talk to us about what term you prefer, and in doing so, answer Barbara's question about how your children relate to that identity?
Okay, well, survivor in my vocabulary of earlier years and even later was people who came back from camps. In other words, in that community of Jewish survivors, it meant that you were in a camp. And so I felt that I was not going to impose that title on myself because I've never been to a camp. And I didn't feel entitled to being a survivor in that same sense. But of course I'm a survivor. I call it, a hidden child survival. But as a survivor, I objected to that title at the time. I don't anymore. I don't care what you call me, actually, as long as you're, as long as you hear my story. Mm-hmm. But I had that problem with that in the beginning. But I learned a lot. I still have a whole stack of papers and letters and things from children between the ages of 12 and 14, whose classes I was giving talks in about their reaction to my story and their reaction of finding out what it was like to be, in a dual life. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about how it affects people, how not normal it is. And to me, frankly, when you live with this all your life, I mean, I lived with it since I was 3.5 years old. To me, it was kind of more or less normal. Yes, you're Jewish, but no, you are not. You have to survive. Survival is your religion, basically. So, but then I realized that to other people, it wasn't like that at all.
Erika, an audience member named Joan is asking whether you're still in touch with other survivors or from your community in Hungary or people who shared wartime experiences with you.
Oh, absolutely. There is in New York after this first conference, a group was established, and so in Montreal, I still lived in Montreal. We established a group in Montreal, but the one in New York was in a particularly interesting way. It was Hungarian child survivors, hidden child survivors, Hungarian. And it was a group of people. We were about like 60 people or something, gathered from all around, and they were all hidden as, they were all Catholics, they were all Jewish, they all had very similar stories of their survival. And that group met once a month, and we told our stories to each other and cried with each other. And it went on for quite a long time in that manner. And it was extremely therapeutic, to not just to me, but to most of the people who participated.
Wow.
And there's still some of them some are still alive, like me, but that some are not, but they are. As a matter of fact, some of them came to my book signing here in Sag Harbor from New York.
Wow.
Yeah. So yes, we established pretty strong connections. And I went around the world. I mean, there were conferences everywhere of hidden children. I went to Australia for a conference in Melbourne. And I went to New Zealand. I went to, where else did I go? Oh, South America. And there were several conferences of hidden children, child survivors around the world.
I realize we have 2 more photos I want to make sure that we share, because they're
Okay.
beautiful examples of your life after the war. So here's the first, which is this must have been in 47 or 48, right?
That's right. 48, I think that was 48. That is going from left, that's Pista, my stepfather. There's Katika, my little sister. That's my mother. And of course, on the right, that's me.
And there's one more here, much more recent.
Oh yeah, that one. Okay. On the left, that's me. The middle, that's my mother. On the right, my sister Katika. And that's in the home that my mother was in Vienna at the end, yeah.
And what became of your biological father?
Pardon me?
What became of your father?
My father, my real father?
Yes.
My real father fled Hungary later than us, but it was 1949, I think, with my grandmother, Kato Neni, who is in the book. And they stayed with us in Vienna for a couple of months. So we all lived together, my father, my grandmother, my stepfather, my mother, everybody in the same apartment. I was in convent school in St. Pölten. And then my father rejoined his sister, my Aunt Haiti, who is on the picture of my father's family. My Aunt Haiti and her second husband, who went to Australia, and they were establishing themselves in Australia. And my father and Kato Neni went to Australia to join her sister and her and the family there. And my father lived in Australia. He came to visit to Montreal a few times with his number 5 wife. He had 5 wives.
Wow.
And but he was very nice. He was really a very good-hearted, nice man.
Your memories are remarkable. And I imagine in part it's because what happened to you was so extreme, that kind of thing sticks with you. Does your younger sister remember much from
Nothing.
your
She's
experiences?
10 years younger than me.
Hmm.
She was a baby. She was 2 years old. Actually, when we went to Kiselang, she was still being nursed by my mother, because my mother wanted to nurse her as long as possible, because then she wouldn't go hungry. So no, my younger sister didn't know that she's Jewish until she was 13 years old.
Wow.
And she found out in a classroom, somebody told her, you Jew, you.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So does she identify as a hidden child?
No, she doesn't identify like anything.
Hmm.
She identifies as Jewish, but not Christian, but not. But her children went to Israel. They were curious. They know their history. I mean, none of them live in denial. Let's put it that way. Which is the only thing that to me is of any importance. There's no denial there.
We're going to conclude in just a moment, since we're reaching the hour. So I want to close by asking you, Erika, what do you feel is the message of your story that you want to leave us with?
What I want to leave you with, what story I want to leave you with?
The message of your story.
The what? The message of the story. Okay. The message of the story is, well, it's not actually twofold. The message of the story is that survival is the most important human condition that you want to aspire for, and it's a very human thing to want to survive. So in order to survive, I think anything is permissible. I think to survive, you can lie, you can cheat, you can steal. You cannot kill. I make a point there, except if somebody wants to kill you, but in self-defense. But I think anything is permissible to achieve survival, and I think that's forgive the word, but it's a sacred legacy to do. You have to try it. That's my grandfather said that, and he was a religious Jew, but he said you have to survive. That's what you're here for, and I very much believe that. I call myself a survivor now in a different sense, not in the same Jewish sense that it was used for before, but I'm a survivor. Something goes wrong. Well, let's see what we can do about it. I'm always on the side of finding solutions because I think it's the most important thing to survive. That would be my, but also there's another message in my book and in my thinking, the damage that those kind of things can do to a person. I mean, I am a survivor and I have put together what I best possibly could, but the damage that it caused to my life, and it wasn't just that I went to 3 different languages, 8 different schools. I went to maybe 6 or 7 different houses, 2 marriages, very, very major upheavals in my life, from medicine to interior design to to changes. And it's because those were the skills, those survival skills that I sort of acquired, and I had to practice them. So, but the damage done to a person in being that many changes, going through that many changes, that many truths that are all lies, or that were all lies, like all the promises of the religion or the promises of other things. It's not something that you can really absorb and forget. It becomes really part of you. And I think that that's the biggest problem with a story like mine. The damage it imposes upon you, and the healing that's so difficult, and it takes a long time. It took me most of my life to get to a point where I can't even say I'm healed, but I'm certainly balanced. I'm okay. I understand what happened to me. I understand how all of those things happened to me. But the damage was very consequential.
Erika, thank you so much for sharing so deeply and honestly your story and your reflections with us today. It's a privilege to learn from you. Your book is terrific, and I encourage everyone in the audience to order Don't Ask My Name, A Hidden Child's Tale of Survival at the link in the Zoom chat. We did record today's discussion, and we'll send a copy of the recording to everyone by email tomorrow. Erika, there are a lot of very nice comments here as well from people who know you and family and friends, so I'll make sure that you get a copy of all of these afterwards.
Wonderful. Then thank you so much. Okay.
Of course.
Oh,
to all of you in the audience, thank you for joining us. Everything we do at the Museum of Jewish Heritage is made possible through donor support. So we thank those of you that are members and donors of our museum. And if you're able, we ask you to consider making a gift in support of our work to preserve the stories of survivors, people like Erika, whose lessons we take in the world with us today. Thank you again, everyone. Erika, take care, and I'll look forward to being in touch.
thank you so much. Okay, bye.